Hello, thank you. All right. In a few weeks, our nation will take pause to celebrate Thanksgiving, a holiday that I find to be quite confusing. Much like many other aspects of American culture, the holiday has a murky and complicated story that is full of contradictory narratives and motives. From the history of how the holiday came to be, the short version being that a woman named Sarah Hale, a magazine editor and author of Mary Had a Little Lamb, simply annoyed American presidents for 35 years until Abraham Lincoln relented and declared in late November a, quote, day of thanksgiving and praise, to the characters of the Pilgrims and Wampanoag that we associate with the holiday, to the complicated undertones of Christianity. Thanksgiving is a collection of myths and traditions that just don't quite add up to the truth. But perhaps that makes it one of the most American of holidays. We like to tell stories about Thanksgiving that are about morals and ethics and people working together in peace. But in reality, the first Thanksgiving is a story about the relationship between the people of North America and the natural world. The group of Wampanoag that participated in that feast weren't friendly neighbors coming for a visit. They were a war chief and 90 men looking to trade for weapons to defend themselves against old tribal enemies, and to clearly demarcate on which side of the river who could plant their crops. The Pilgrims simply didn't know how to exploit the land of southern Massachusetts yet, and in exchange for a soon-to-be-broken promise of peace, they took assistance from the natives who had been exploiting this area in their own way for countless generations. The earliest years of white settlement in New England were dominated by the need for those settlers to learn how to hunt and harvest in this new climate, which is why, alongside turkey and corn, the three-day feast featured a significant amount of shellfish and venison, two staples of the diet with anyone attempting subsistence living on the Atlantic coast. The first Thanksgiving was an economic venture based on the natural world of the participants who were living there. But Thanksgiving isn't the only place that we do this. We tell stories about our origins and use words like liberty and freedom all the time. We give our historical figures broad, sweeping, moral, and ethical foresight. We like to talk about the American Revolution as the Enlightenment in action. But America's most driving force 400 years ago is the same as it is today. Economics based on the exploitation of nature and the resources that are so abundant on this continent. Perhaps my favorite example of how we tell ourselves these stories of grandeur about our past comes from the third to final paragraph of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. The narrator of the story, Nick Carraway, is trying to find meaning in the excesses of elaborate wealth in the roaring 20s, and says this as he stands on the coast of Long Island. As the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away, until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the new world. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. Leave aside both of the brilliance of Fitzgerald's vocabulary and the complete lack of acknowledgement that Native Americans had been living on this, quote, fresh green breast of the New World for generations, and think about some of those phrases. Compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. Perhaps we can forgive Fitzgerald for not anticipating a man landing on the moon a few decades later, or the Hubble telescope's capturing of the Pillars of Creation photograph of the Eagle Nebula 7,000 light years from Earth, or even the Mars Pathfinder sending back images from another planet. It's a pretty overinflated sense of importance for a handful of Dutch sailors looking for a good place to fish for cod. This trend of misunderstanding the motivations of the first European settlers coming to the Americas is rampant across our stories. In school, children are taught that Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement in the Americas, but the reason this settlement was built is rarely covered and little understood. The settlement was founded by the Virginia Company, which in turn was founded by a group of wealthy Londoners, including a man named Richard Hakluyt. Hakluyt's involvement is significant because for 20 preceding years, he had been publicly arguing that the English could solve their firewood shortage that was literally resulting in poor people freezing to death in the winters by simply taking trees from the Americas. The British had so thoroughly decimated their own environment that by the mid-1600s, the only forests remaining were those set aside for the royal family to hunt in. Jamestown was the beginning of a full-scale invasion of European settlers into North America, and it was founded in order to export firewood. Trees have long been one of the most important resources in North America. In 2018, the US exported $9.6 billion of lumber. Historically, trees were even more important. Not only were they a draw for exporters to Europe, but clearing forest was an incredibly important component of early settlers' goals. These European settlers needed to clear the forest for many reasons. First, they needed the wood as fuel for cooking and heating their homes in this new landscape with much harsher winters than what they were used to in Western Europe. Second, they needed this wood to build their homes, churches, schools, and businesses. And third, they needed the wood to build fences as private ownership of land plots came to practice on this continent for the first time. And finally, they needed to clear the forest because their puritanical version of Christianity took the Old Testament seriously, and they believed that the Bible required them to do so. The early white settlers of the Atlantic coast took very seriously the concept of dominions. The Puritans believed that it was their religious duty to control nature. In their view, Genesis 1:28, which we already read earlier, provided them with the order to do so. Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and every other living thing that moves upon the earth. The earliest European settlers in North America took that passage literally. They believed that it was God's will for them to transform every inch of the earth into productive and labored land, and they believed that humans occupied a special place outside the natural world, in between nature and God. They believed that nature was something given to them by God to mold and shape into a perfect world controlled by independent, capitalist, Christian, yeoman farmers. And they believed that the forest itself was evil. What's the evidence that they thought the forest was evil? Think about how many of our folk stories of European background that use the forest as the setting for everything bad that happens. The evil witch, she always lives in the forest. Hansel and Gretel, kidnapped in the forest. Little Red Riding Hood, she's eaten in the forest. Snow White, the evil witch, controls the forest. The forest was a sign of the dark and unknown, and that made it foreboding and terrifying for the highly superstitious Puritan settlers. The destructions of the forest of the eastern seaboard were devastating for the natural world of North America. It is estimated that for 15,000 consecutive years, the populations of the passenger pigeon in North America numbered in the billions. Accounts of early European explorers like Samuel Champlain talked about flocks of the birds so large that they would darken the sky as if it was nighttime. A few hundred years later, due to both overhunting and habitat destruction, the passenger pigeon was extinct. The story is the same for the Carolina parakeet. The only member of the parrot family that ever lived north of modern-day Texas, this beautiful bird had a range that extended into southern New York and Ohio. Just 4 years after the last passenger pigeon died, the last of the Carolina parakeets died as well. In the time since those early European settlers, it is difficult to see how we've improved our exploitative relationship with nature. Throughout the 1800s, we killed tens of millions of bison and nearly drove them into extinction so we could more easily lay train tracks across the Great Plains. We cut down hundreds of thousands of trees across New York to dig a trench that made it slightly faster to move trade goods across the region. Building the Erie Canal was an environmental destroyer in its own right, but then subsequently resulted in the spread of numerous invasive species that have wreaked havoc on the Great Lakes. Most notably, the sea lamprey that has reduced fish populations in ways we cannot fully comprehend. In the 1950s and 60s, we used so much DDT insecticide that on our crops that we sent nearly a dozen species of birds of prey to the brink of extinction. We have poisoned countless water sources all across the nation by fracking and drilling to take that last little bit of petroleum from the ground. And since 1750, the United States, while being only a tiny percentage of the world's population, has contributed a quarter of global emissions of carbon dioxide. Today, we see more and more signs of catastrophic climate change all around. 70% of biologists now agree that the sixth mass extinction event in the 4.5 billion year history of this planet has begun as a direct result of human activity. A study from earlier this year found that only 3% of the Earth's land surface is ecologically intact and free from human impact. The United Nations report threatens that up to 1 million species are in danger of going extinct in just the next few decades. The history of how we've interacted with nature is bleak and filled with sad stories, but there is some good news. According to a Pew Research poll, 68% of Americans believe that the government should do more to protect our lakes, rivers, and streams, and 70% of New Yorkers passed a constitutional amendment to say that last week, or earlier this week. I lose track of time. That same study found that 2/3 of Americans believe the government should do more to reduce the effects of climate change. And we know from recent history that government policy can have significant impacts on the way we treat the world around us. Since DDT was banned, most of the birds of prey species nearly killed off by DDT are no longer endangered. In just 50 years, the bald eagle went from the brink of extinction to its classification of least concern. Modern infrastructure projects take into account environmental impacts prior to breaking ground as to prevent the ecological disasters that the Erie Canal created. The Army Corps of Engineers has come up with multiple ingenious solutions to prevent Asian carp from entering the Great Lakes waterways and wreaking the same havoc that the sea lamprey did several decades ago. The American bison, which in 1884 consisted of only 325 remaining individuals, now numbers in the hundreds of thousands, and wild herds are growing and beginning to be returned to some of their traditional territories. When humans vacate an area and leave it to nature, ecological succession will occur, and the forest will eventually grow back. We have many success stories of how we found the errors in our way and how we treat our natural world. We have the ingenuity and ability to continue to make positive changes, and we have successfully convinced the majority of the American people that these changes are necessary. Now we must hold both our corporations and the government accountable to these actions. We must continue to pressure our elected officials to do more to protect the environment before it is too late. We must continue to work to change the narrative that humans are separate from nature and continue to shape and influence our culture and fellow citizens to join us in living in accordance with our seventh principle, respecting the interdependent web of existence of which we are a part. I'll leave you today with the words of Carl Sagan, who in 1994 was talking about the iconic pale blue dot photograph. Look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar and supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species can migrate. Visit, yes. Settle, not yet. Like it or not, for the moment, the earth is where we make our stand. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we have ever known.